Pay close attention to what happens next, because the watch that Harrison Beaumont dismissed as junk, the one he practically laughed at when he handed it back, was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. Callum Reyes didn't look like someone worth paying attention to. He walked into Beaumont's on a Thursday afternoon in late October, wearing steel-toed boots with a crack along the left toe cap and a canvas jacket that still had grease under the collar from a job he'd finished 2 days earlier. He had the kind of hands that told the whole story before he said a word, thick across the knuckles, scarred in a few places, nails cut short and clean but darkened at the edges in a way that doesn't wash out. He was 41 years old, and he drove a 2009 pickup truck that he'd rebuilt the transmission on himself twice. He was holding his daughter's hand. Mira was 8. She wore her hair in 2 braids that weren't quite even because Callum had done them himself that morning, the way he did every morning, standing in their bathroom in Sudbury with a YouTube tutorial paused on his phone, and a brush he still wasn't entirely sure how to use. She had her mother's eyes. Callum tried not to think about that too hard on most days, but in public, when people looked at Mira and then looked at him with that particular kind of expression. The one that asked what a man like him was doing with a child this gentle. He thought about it a lot. Beaumont's fine timepieces had been on Elgin Street for 30 years. It was the kind of shop that made you feel underdressed when you walked past it, let alone through the door. Display cases lit from below, velvet trays, a faint smell of something expensive that Callum couldn't name. Harrison Beaumont himself was behind the counter when they came in. He was 60 perhaps, with silver hair combed flat and a gray suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who've always had expensive things. He looked at Callum's boots first, then at Mira, then at the small cardboard box Callum was carrying under his arm. He didn't say anything yet. He didn't need to. The look was enough. Callum had found the watch 4 days earlier in a shoebox at the back of a storage unit he'd bid on through an online auction. He'd been doing that for about 1.5 years, buying abandoned units, clearing them out, reselling what he could. It wasn't glamorous. It was a way to make a little extra money on weekends, something to do with his hands that wasn't sitting in the apartment listening to Myra sleep and thinking about everything that had gone wrong since Eleanor died. He'd paid $60 for the unit. Most of it was boxes of old paperbacks and a broken exercise bike. But at the very back, behind a water-damaged cabinet, there was a shoebox. Inside the shoebox, wrapped in a piece of chamois cloth that had gone stiff with age, was the watch. He didn't know what he was looking at, exactly. He could see it was old. The case was gold-colored, or had been once. It was tarnished badly, darkened to a brownish green in the grooves, and the crystal over the face had a crack running diagonally from 9 to 3. The dial was ivory-colored with Roman numerals and a small subsidiary seconds dial at 6 o'clock. There was writing on the dial, but it was hard to read through the damaged crystal. On the back of the case there was an engraving, something worn almost smooth that might have been initials, or a crest, or both. He'd looked at it for a long time at his workbench that night. Mira already asleep. The shop manual he was supposed to be reading for a client's engine pushed to the side. Something about it made him careful. He cleaned around the edges of the case gently, with a soft cloth. He didn't try to open it. He took 6 photographs from different angles and uploaded them to a watch forum he'd found online. And by the next morning, there were 11 responses. Most of them were people asking where he'd gotten it. One of them was a man in Montreal who collected horological antiques and had posted a reply that was 4 paragraphs long and contained 3 words Callum had to look up. The man said the design of the dial was consistent with Swiss pocket watches made in the second half of the 19th century. He said the style of the engraving on the movement, which he could partially make out in one of the photographs, suggested a Geneva workshop. He said the subsidiary seconds dial and the particular shape of the hands were details he associated with a specific tier of watchmaker. He said, at the end of his 4 paragraphs, that Callum should have the watch examined in person by someone who knew what they were doing, and that if it was what he thought it might be, Callum should be very careful about who he showed it to. Callum read that last sentence 3 times. He went looking for a watchmaker. There was one in Sudbury, an older man, who serviced watches from a back room behind a dry cleaner's, but when Callum described what he had, the man told him it was out of his area. He mentioned Beaumont's in Ottawa, he said. Harrison Beaumont had been appraising antique timepieces for decades and had connections with auction houses in Toronto and London. He said it like it was a good thing. Callum made the drive on his day off, Mira in the back seat with a library book and a bag of pretzels. Harrison Beaumont took the box from Callum without asking. He set it on the glass counter and opened it and looked at the watch without touching it for a moment. Then he picked it up, turning it in his fingers, and looked at the dial through a loop he pulled from his breast pocket. "Where did you get this?" he said. He said it the way someone says a thing when they already have a theory and the question is just a formality, Callum told him. "Storage unit. Online auction. $60. Beaumont set the watch down on the velvet mat he'd placed on the counter. "The crystal is cracked," he said. "The case has significant oxidation. There's a dent here, on the band." He indicated with one finger without touching. That suggests it was dropped at some point, possibly more than once. He turned it over. The engraving on the back is almost entirely worn away. Whoever owned this before you did not take particularly good care of it. "I was wondering if it might be valuable," Callum said. Beaumont looked at him. Not at the watch. At him. "I couldn't tell you much without examining the movement," he said. "And I'd need to open the case properly. That requires time." He paused. "I can make you an offer on it today as is. That would save you the wait." Callum looked at the watch on the velvet mat. "What kind of offer?" $800. Mira looked up from the corner of the room where she'd sat down on a small bench, the library book in her lap. Callum thought about the forum post. The man in Montreal. "Be very careful about who you show it to." "I think I'd rather wait and have it looked at properly," he said. Something moved across Beaumont's face, quick and controlled, and then it was gone. "Of course," he said. "I should tell you, the market for pieces like this, even if the movement is intact, is quite narrow. It's not the kind of thing that goes at auction for significant sums anymore. The market has shifted. There's more interest in pieces from the early 20th century, the Swiss dress watch era. Victorian pocket watches, even from quality makers, can be difficult to place." Callum nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I'd still like to have it assessed." He picked up the watch and put it back in the box. Beaumont watched him do it. "I'd encourage you to be realistic about expectations," he said. "Based on visible condition alone, you're looking at something that appeals to a very specific collector. I wouldn't want you to spend time and money on an assessment and come away disappointed." "I appreciate that," Callum said. He thanked the man and took Mira's hand and walked out. In the truck, Mira climbed up into the passenger seat and buckled herself in, and looked at him. "Did he help?" "Not really," Callum said. "Was he mean?" Callum started the engine. "He was polite," he said. "There's a kind of mean that comes disguised as polite. It's harder to deal with than the regular kind." Mira considered this. Was he the disguised kind? "Yeah," Callum said. "I think he was." He drove home with the box on the seat between them. That night, after Mira was asleep, Callum sat at his workbench and took the watch out again and looked at it. He thought about the $800. It would have covered 2 months of Myra's after-school program and the new brake pads on the truck that he'd been putting off. He thought about how easy it would have been to take it. He thought about the way Beaumont had looked at him when he walked in, and the way he'd explained the narrow market and the shifting interest and the realistic expectations. All of it delivered in the patient tone of a man who was quite certain he was talking to someone who didn't know any better. He took out his phone and emailed the man in Montreal. His name was François Labelle, and he replied within an hour, which Callum thought was either a good sign or a sign that the man had very few friends. The email was detailed. He asked for the photographs again, higher resolution if possible. He asked whether Callum had noticed any markings on the movement and whether the crown, the winding mechanism, had any unusual shaping. He said he had been thinking about the piece since he first saw it on the forum. He said there was a particular feature in one of the photographs that he wanted to examine more closely. The feature was a small mark on the edge of the dial, barely visible even in the photograph. Callum looked at it under a magnifying lens he used for circuit board work. It was a hallmark, a small punched mark, oval, with something inside it that he could not quite resolve. He photographed it again, as close as he could get. He sent it to LaBelle. The reply came back at 11:17 at night. It was one sentence. "I need you to call me," Callum called him. LaBelle picked up on the second ring. He had a slight accent, Quebecois, and he spoke carefully and in precise sentences. He told Callum that the hallmark in the photograph was consistent with a mark used by a specific Geneva workshop in the 1870s and 1880s. He said the workshop was called Maison Archambault et Fils. He said the name might not mean much to Callum, but that in collector circles, pieces from this workshop, authenticated pieces, which were rare, commanded significant prices. He said the last authenticated Maison Archambault pocket watch to appear at public auction had sold in Geneva 4 years ago. He paused. "How much?" Callum said. LaBelle told him. Callum sat very still at his workbench for a moment. "That was a different piece," LaBelle said carefully, "in better cosmetic condition. The authentication process is what drives the value. Without authentication, you have something interesting. With it," he paused again, "you have something else entirely." Callum asked him what authentication would involve. LaBelle told him. There was a horological institute in Toronto that worked with pieces from this period. There was also a specialist in London, a woman who had written the only academic monograph on Geneva workshop marks from the late 19th century, and who had authenticated several Maison Archambault pieces over the course of her career. He gave Callum both names. He said the process could take several weeks and would cost money, but that if the piece was what he thought it was, the cost would be irrelevant. Before they hung up, LaBelle said one more thing. He said Callum should not go back to the man who'd offered him $800. Callum said he had no intention of it. He spent the next 6 weeks working his regular job during the days. Diesel engines, mostly fleet vehicles for a construction company out of Chelmsford, and spending his evenings reading everything he could find about 19th century Swiss watchmaking. He read about the Geneva workshops, the guilds, the traditions of hand finishing and decoration that made certain pieces different from anything that came before or after. He read about Maison Archambault specifically in a chapter of an old auction catalog that LaBelle scanned and emailed to him. The workshop had operated from 1861 to 1899. It had made watches for members of European nobility, and at least 2 of the watches it produced had ended up in museums. The founder, a man named Henri Archambault, had been known for a particular method of decorating the movement, a combination of hand engraving and a surface treatment called perlage that made his pieces identifiable even before the hallmarks were read. The piece went to Toronto in early December, packed carefully in a case that Callum built himself from foam and a plastic container. He drove it there personally. Mira came with him, because the school break had started and he didn't have anyone to leave her with, and also because she had become, in a quiet way, invested in the outcome. She'd heard enough of his phone calls with LaBelle to understand the shape of what was happening, and she was the kind of child who paid attention to shapes. The woman at the Toronto Institute was named Dr. Sylvia Okafor. She was in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a way of moving around her workbench that made it clear she had spent most of her life in close proximity to small, complicated things. She took the watch from Callum and looked at it and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. "When did you say you acquired this?" she asked. "About 2 months ago," Callum said. "Storage unit auction." She looked at the watch. "And you drove from Sudbury?" "Yes." She looked at him then over the top of her glasses. "Sit down," she said. This is going to take a while. Mira sat beside Callum on a small wooden bench along the wall and quietly read her book. Dr. Okafor worked at her bench. She didn't narrate. She didn't explain. The room was very quiet except for the occasional faint sound of instruments, and once, at some point in the middle of the afternoon, a small exclamation that she made under her breath and then did not elaborate on. At 4:30, she set down her tools and turned to them. "The movement is intact," she said. "The pearlage on the plates and the style of the cock engraving are consistent with Archambault's work from the period 1874 to 1882. The hallmark is genuine. There is a small inscription on the inner case." She held up a photograph she'd taken, magnified, that has been partially worn but is still legible. It appears to be a name and a date. 1879. Callum looked at the photograph. He could make out the letters now that they'd been enhanced. A name, a date that corresponded to the year of manufacture. "What does that mean for authentication?" he asked. "It means I'm going to contact a colleague in London," she said. "But informally, off the record, I can tell you that in 22 years of examining timepieces in this period, I have seen 4 authenticated Archambault movements. This is consistent with all of them. The condition of the dial and case is poor, but the movement." She paused, and something crossed her face that Callum thought might have been the professional equivalent of joy. "The movement is extraordinary." She sent her report to the specialist in London, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, whose book on Geneva hallmarks Callum had by this point read twice. Dr. Vance's response arrived 10 days later. It was 7 pages. Callum read it carefully, his reading glass in quiet, Mira asleep. The language was technical in places, but the conclusion was not. Dr. Vance was of the opinion that the piece was a genuine Maison Archambault movement, almost certainly produced for a private commission given the inscription, and should be submitted to formal auction with full documentation. She had included, at the end of the report, a comparable sales estimate. Callum sat back in his chair. He looked at the number for a long time. He called Labelle the next morning. "I know," Labelle said, when Callum read him the figure. He sounded calm about it, the way a man sounds calm when he has already worked through his feelings about a thing and is now on the other side. "I had a feeling when I first saw the photograph, the hallmark, but you can never be certain until someone opens it. I need to find an auction house," Callum said. Labelle had already made some inquiries. There was a house in Toronto with a department that handled horological antiques. There was also the option of London or Geneva, where the collector base for this specific period was larger. He said the choice would affect the realized price. He said Callum should take his time. Callum took 2 weeks. He spoke with 3 auction specialists. He asked questions that he would not have known to ask 2 months earlier, and listened carefully to the answers. He chose the Toronto house partly for practical reasons and partly because the specialist there, a young man named Daniel Park, was the only one of the 3 who talked to him like a person rather than a transaction. The watch was consigned in February. The auction was set for late March. Callum told Mira over dinner, the night after he signed the consignment agreement. "So what happens now?" she said. "We wait," he said. "Are you nervous?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. Mira pushed pasta around her plate. "What are you nervous about? That it won't go the way everyone thinks. That I've spent all this time, and it turns out I was wrong about something." Mira considered this. "But you weren't though," she said. "Were you?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," he said. "I don't think I was." The auction was on a Tuesday. Callum drove to Toronto the night before and stayed in a budget hotel near the venue with Mira, who had been allowed to miss 2 days of school for reasons he had described to the office as a family matter, which was accurate. They ate at a diner near the hotel, and Mira ordered pancakes even though it was dinner time, and Callum didn't say anything about it because there were a few things that simply did not matter. He slept badly. He lay in the dark and listened to Mira, breathing in the other bed, and thought about Eleanor, the way he often did in the hours before significant things. Eleanor had been the one who believed in things before they happened. Callum had always been better at fixing them after they broke. He thought about what she would have said, looking at this particular sequence of events: the storage unit, the shoebox, the forum post, the man in Montreal, the 2 doctors, the 7-page report, this hotel room. He thought she would have laughed. Not unkindly, just with the specific delight she'd had for things that surprised her. He fell asleep around 3. The auction room was smaller than he'd expected and fuller. Daniel Park met them at the door and showed them to their seats. He explained the process, which Callum already knew but listened to anyway. The watch was lot 47. The bidding opened at a figure that would have seemed impossible to Callum 5 months ago. It climbed steadily. There was a phone bidder. Someone Park had mentioned was calling from Europe, and they were the one who kept pushing the number up past the points where the room thinned out. By the end there were 2 bidders, the phone, and a man near the front whom Callum could not see clearly. They went back and forth 3 times. The hammer came down. Callum looked at the number on the board. He had prepared himself for the estimate. He had read the documentation. He had talked to LaBelle twice in the week before, and LaBelle had said the collector interest had been strong. He had done everything a reasonable person could do to prepare himself for this outcome. It still felt like something falling, in the best possible way, that sensation of letting go of something you've been holding for a long time. Mira grabbed his arm. "Dad," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Dad, I know," he said. He did not cry in the auction room. He was careful about that. But in the elevator afterward, just the 2 of them, he pressed the button for the lobby and stood quietly for a moment. And Mira stood beside him and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Outside the auction house on King Street, the March air was still cold, and there was a skin of old snow on the parked cars, and Callum stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street for a minute. He thought about the drive home. He thought about the apartment in Sudbury with the draft under the kitchen door he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. He thought about Mira's school and whether they might look at a house now, something with a yard, something with a room that could be a proper workshop. He thought about a lot of things, but he kept coming back to the same thing, to a moment in the autumn, standing in front of a glass counter in Ottawa, with his cracked boot and his grease-stained collar and a shoebox under his arm, while a very polished man explained to him the narrowing market and the shifting interest and the importance of realistic expectations. He wondered if Harrison Beaumont had seen the sale report. Pieces like that one, when they sold for what that one had sold for, the reports circulated. The auction house published them. The trade publications picked them up. The forums talked about them. It was the kind of number that did not stay quiet. He found out 3 weeks later from LaBelle, who had seen a note in a newsletter that circulated among serious collectors in Canada and Europe. The note mentioned the sale, the provenance, and the storage unit in northern Ontario where the piece had been found. It did not mention Callum by name, but it mentioned the city. It also mentioned briefly that the piece had been brought to a dealer in Ottawa prior to sale, and that the dealer had offered $800 for it. LaBelle said he'd heard the note had generated some conversation in the trade. He said it with the particular neutrality of someone who found the situation quietly satisfying. Callum said he was glad it had sold well. LaBelle laughed. Mira was in the yard when he came off the call. They had moved by then into a house on the east side of Sudbury with a yard that backed onto a stand of birch trees. It was April. The yard was still muddy at the edges, but she'd found a dry patch near the fence and was crouching there, looking at something on the ground. He went out and crouched beside her. There was a small beetle making its way across a flat piece of bark. They watched it for a while. "What did Francois want?" she said. She'd started calling LaBelle by his first name at some point, which LaBelle had told Callum he found extremely charming. "Just to share some news," Callum said. "Good news." He thought about the $800. He thought about the boots and the grease and the way a man could look at you without quite looking at you. He thought about Mira's braids that weren't quite even, and Eleanor's eyes, and the shoebox at the back of a storage unit that somebody had decided was worth nothing. He thought about all of it, and the particular shape it had made. "Yeah," he said, "good news." The beetle reached the edge of the bark and disappeared into the grass, and Mira watched it go, and the birch trees at the back of the yard were just beginning to show the first pale green of the year.